Oh, they thought they could have smart fate. They thought love was a formula, a math equation, something you could weigh, measure, dissect like a corpse on a cold steel table. They didn't want romance. They wanted proof. Proof that you and them were written in the stars. Soulmates, fated, destined. So what did they do? They paid a psychologist, a professional, someone with degrees, credentials, framed certificates, and a clipboard heavy with numbers, graphs, percentages, science. Cold, hard, unbiased science. And they waited. Oh, how they waited, like sinners begging a priest for absolution, praying the data would whisper, yes, he belonged together. But the universe, it has a sense of humor sharper than any blade, because the verdict was divine devastation, compatibility, zero, connection, illusion, future together, not even in the multiverse. God himself signed the death certificate, stamped it with thunder and tears. And now they sit there trembling, their little hands shaking like leaves in a storm, clutching the papers they paid for, the truth they begged to see. They thought they'd get hope. Instead, they got annihilation. See, love wasn't your story, it was their hallucination. A fantasy painted over reality like cheap perfume masking rot. And the psychologist, they didn't kill the dream, they just held up a mirror so clear, so cold, even God himself could see the cracks. And the best part, he didn't need the verdict. You knew. You always knew. While they hired experts to validate the lie, you stood in the truth alone, untouched, free. Wanted to believe you were their missing piece. The cure for their emptiness. The answer to prayers they didn't even know they whispered at night. But you, oh, you were never a missing piece. You were the whole damn puzzle. And now they sit in ruins. The temple to delusion collapsed in their trembling hands. They paid for the truth, and the truth cut deeper than any blade. But here's where it gets beautiful, delicious even. Because now you stand above it all. No guilt, no grief, no regret, just clarity. He didn't lose, he didn't fall, he rose. Then they shuddered under the weight of their own lives. And when they look at you now strong, whole, unshaken, they realize something even darker. It was never about love. No, it was about control. Who bends? Who breaks? Who begs? Then you? You walked away without a scratch. No tears, no pleas, no looking back. And that is what breaks them the most. Because they paid a psychologist to explain your connection, and all they got was a divine obituary signed by fate itself. Case closed, verdict delivered. Soulmates, never. And now they have to live with the truth you already made peace with long ago. Oh, they thought science would save them, and they thought logic would spare them. They paid a psychologist, a specialist trained to dissect hearts with cold precision to study you, to study them, to study the two of you together, as if love could be measured like blood pressure, as if connection could be calculated like tax returns. I wanted answers, data, certainty, a scientific prophecy carved into a clipboard. But what they never realized, what they were too blind, too arrogant to see, is that no mortal can measure what God himself already ruled upon. Because long before the therapist took notes, long before the questionnaires were filled out, long before they whispered their desperate hopes into the ears of human experts, heaven had already spoken. And when God's hand moved, the verdict wasn't written in ink. It was carved in the stone. Thunder cracking through the sky as angels turned their faces away in sorrow. This union shall not stand. They could have heard it if they listened closely, in the silence between your words, in the weight behind your glances, in the ache that lit beneath every forced smile. But no, they didn't want divine truth. They wanted permission to believe their own lie. So they paid for analysis. They paid for clinical validation. They paid for a psychological autopsy of something already dead. And when the expert handed them the results, they thought that was the final blow. Oh, how wrong they were. Because the real verdict, the one that shattered the heavens and echoed through eternity, that belonged to God. And God. He didn't just say no. He said never. He said what you built was cursed from the first hello. Because you weren't partners, you were punishments for each other. Karmic debts dressed up as romance. Two souls trying to force themselves into alignment when heaven had already torn them apart in a past life. And now they sit there, clutching the papers, trembling, thinking they're crying over the psychologist's words. But the truth, their spirit recognizes something far worse: the weight of divine rejection. The cold, unyielding silence of God turning his face away from the altar they tried to build. You see, love, real love, is blessed. It glows from the inside out. It flows without force. It feels like prayer answered. But this was never love. This was a rebellion against divine order. This was two souls trying to write their own gospel, ignoring the commandments written into their bones. And now they realize they didn't just lose you. They lost God's favor. They lost the blessing that turns two into one. They fought heaven and lost. And you stand there not out of cruelty, no, you stand there in obedience. Because you heard God the first time. You felt his tug at your spirit when you knew this was wrong, when you knew this was forced, when you knew this was not your destined path. And instead of clinging to the corpse, you chose faith. You chose trusting the unseen over clutching the broken. That is why you are standing tall, not because you're heartless, but because your heart belongs to something higher than human attachment. And now they sit in the rubble, staring not just at lost love, but at spiritual eviction. Because God doesn't bless unions built on fear. He doesn't bless connections born from loneliness instead of purpose. He doesn't anoint what was forged in desperation instead of divine alignment. And now they don't just mourn you. They mourn the fact that heaven itself refused to bless their altar. That's why they can't breathe. That's why the air tastes metallic. That's why the silence burns hotter than hell itself. Because they didn't just lose a partner. They lost their illusion of control. They lost the fantasy that they could rewrite what God had already stamped with deny. And You don't celebrate their pain. No, you simply step back and let divine justice do what it does best. Reveal the truth, no matter how much it hurts. And here's the final twist, the one that breaks them forever. They could have saved themselves this torment if they had prayed instead of plotted. If they had sought wisdom instead of a verdict. If they had asked God to guide them before they tried to force you to fit their fantasy. But they didn't. Because they didn't want truth. They wanted permission. And now they sit in the ashes of their own making, trembling at the realization that the hand they thought they were holding was never yours. It was God's hand pulling you away from them all along. And that's the kind of heartbreak no psychologist can fix. That's divine rejection, and it leaves scars on the soul that never fade. So now tell me, doesn't that just sting? Doesn't that just sear their spirit like holy fire? They wanted a psychologist's opinion, but they got God's verdict. They thought this was about heartbreak. That they thought this was about losing you. But no, this was about God showing them exactly what happens when you ignore divine order and chase your own desires like a hungry beast. See, this was never just a love story. This was a spiritual case file opened in heaven the moment they laid eyes on you when their flesh wanted you, but their spirit trembled in warning. Because the truth is, they never approached you with prayer. They approached you with possession. They didn't ask God if you were meant for them. They decided it themselves, then tried to manifest you into submission. And God, He watched. Not because He's cruel, but because sometimes the only way to teach a hard-headed soul is to let them build their own Tower of Babel just so they can watch it collapse into dust. They paid psychologists for compatibility reports, thinking science would outsmart the spirit. They lit candles and whispered affirmations, thinking they could manifest what heaven had already rejected. They stopped your birth chart, trying to find cosmic loopholes. But all the astrology in the world couldn't overwrite one simple truth. When God says no, the whole universe stands still to make sure it never happens. You were never their soulmate. You were never their twin flame. You were the mirror God set to show them their own unhealed desperation. But they were so blinded by obsession that they mistook reflection for connection. They didn't love you. They loved the fantasy they projected onto you. They loved the version of you they built in their mind, not the real you God was protecting. And now they sit in silence, and for the first time they hear something louder than their own desires. They hear the absence of God's approval. You see, when God blesses something, you can feel it in your bones. And the air tastes sweeter. The path feels smoother. Even the obstacles become opportunities. But this was resistance at every turn. This was prayers that fell flat. This was a spirit that screamed no every time they tried to force yes. Because what they wanted wasn't love, it was control. They didn't want a partner, they wanted a puppet. And God don't bless puppets. He blesses purpose. They ignored the red flags, ignored the sleepless nights, ignored the fact that every time they held your hand, it felt more like grasping at sand slipping through their fingers. And now they know why. Because God Himself was the one pulling you away. This was never sabotage, this was salvation. This was God saying, I will not let my child be chained to someone I never chose for them. They wanted therapy to fix it, but you can't therapy your way out of a divine mismatch. You can't outsmart the architect of your destiny. You can't negotiate with a God who already saw how this would end. And now they sit there, papers in hand, tears in their throat, shaking not because of what the psychologist said, but because of what their spirit always knew. This was never love. This was a warning disguised as romance. And you walked away not because you stopped caring, but because you started listening. Listening to that quiet voice inside you, the voice that sounded a lot like God saying, my child, this is not your person, this is your lesson. And when you finally obeyed, heaven opened doors for you that no human could close. Peace returned. Clarity came back. And love, the real kind, started whispering your name from places you haven't even discovered yet. But them, they sit in the silence, a silence so thick it feels like judgment. As it is. They didn't just lose you, they lost God's favor over this connection. And that's a loss that no amount of therapy, witchcraft, or wishful thinking can reverse. Because when God shuts a door, he bolts it from both sides. And the only key is obedience. So now they're left with nothing but the truth they tried to outrun. You were never theirs to keep. You were God's all along. And that's a heartbreak no human heart is built to survive. That's the kind of grief that only comes from realizing you didn't just lose love, you lost a battle with God himself. Case closed. Heaven has spoken. And the only prayer left is the one they should have started with. Or, not my will but yours be done.